Live.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. I hope you and your loved ones are safe. We welcome you all to the first discussion of this virtual, scientific, and educative knowledge series curated by the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India in collaboration with International Alliance of Patients Organization, Healthcare Federation of India, the Indian Pharmaceutical Association, and SIA Farm Forum, a forum of FIP and WHO with National Pharmaceutical Association of the Southeast Asian region. These five associations have joined hands to support the Indian central and state government efforts to ensure dissemination of correct and factual information on COVID-19 and to encourage people to get vaccinated upon their turn. Our campaign, No One is Safe Until Everyone is Safe, was launched on 14th June, and this knowledge series is an extension of this campaign. We have planned today's panel discussion keeping in mind the increasing numbers of infections during COVID-19 across the country. Our eminent panel will be discussing the reasons and management options around the same. Without much ado, let me introduce you all to the moderator of this session, Dr. Abdul Ansari. Dr. Ansari is Director Critical Care Services at Nanavati Super Speciality Hospital in Mumbai. He has 20 years of experience in critical care and is a teacher and guide for diploma and fellowship programs in critical care. He has also been a faculty in national conference and regional seminars. Dr. Ansari's areas of interest besides critical care are in nephrology, extracorporeal therapies, and sepsis. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Ansari, and over to you to introduce the panel and set the context for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Asawari, for a kind introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank OP for organizing this wonderful knowledge series, and I think there's a need of the hour. As we are moving into a phase 3, probably a phase 3 which is waiting in the dark or looming around, it's time for us to look back as well as look forward, and we need to learn the lessons and probably not repeat the same mistakes. So OP, IIP, IPA, and SEER, they all have come together in kind of a knowledge dissemination program, and I am very thankful to be a part of this session. And with me are one of the three very eminent infectious disease stalwarts, Dr. Atul Patel, Director of Infectious Disease at Sterling Hospital, Ahmedabad, who is also a founding member of Asia Fungal Working Group, as well as Fungal Infection Study Forum. Welcome, Dr. Atul Patel.
Thank you.
With us is Dr. V. Ramasubramaniam, a very eminent infectious disease consultant from Chennai, and he has been singularly responsible for making infectious disease a specialty in our country. And he is currently working with Apollo Hospital, Chennai, as Professor of Infectious Diseases at MGR Medical University, Chennai, and has multiple papers and in infectious disease journals to his credit. And finally, Dr. Vasant Nagvekar, a very dear colleague from Lilavati Hospital, who is also now at Global Hospital, a very senior infectious disease consultant from Mumbai, who is a pioneer in working in MDR infections, and very soon he is going to have a publication coming about the zone of hope. I will not speak about much, but talking about how to tame the menace of MDR bacterial infections. So with this background, I'm thanking this wonderful platform for knowledge dissemination, and I understand that our audience would be a various mix of people who have different pharmacological background with pharmaceutical industry as well as medical background. We will try to keep it as simple and try to also answer as many complex questions during the session. And the whole course of session will be actually moving into a kind of simple coffee table discussion about COVID-19 and the looming threat of opportunistic infections. Predominantly, we all know fungal infections are not hidden anymore. In fact, there are enough names, ominous names like black fungus and white fungus, which is coming around. So we need to, remove the what is called the confusion around it. At the same time, get to the crux of the matter: how to identify, appropriately treat, and eradicate. So, with this, I will first of all open up this question session with Dr. Atul Patel about why are we talking about opportunistic infections in the middle of a viral pandemic, which is, raging and not coming to any end, threatening to have third or fourth wave. So why do you really think? Is it like we are waking up from a bad nightmare, or is it a reality?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. When we talk about the opportunistic fungus infections, so that means that these fungus are generally cannot produce these infections in the immunocompetent host. So whenever these fungi get an opportunity to a host where either innate immune system or adaptive immune system or the cell-mediated immune system is compromised and host is immunocompromised, then and then in such situation, this fungi get an excess or can produces infection. And we know that like COVID-19, this infection is producing significant dysregulated immune system involving innate immune system, involving adaptive immune system. And during the course of treatment of this COVID-19, the clinician will have to use variety of anti-inflammatory agents, which include steroids, and sometimes we need to augment the anti-inflammatory by using some monoclonal antibodies. And because of this dysregulated immune system and the need of anti-inflammatory agents, the immune system of these COVID-19 patients is compromised, especially when the COVID-19 patient is of moderate to severe illness and the patient is having critical illness with COVID-19. And because of this compromised immune system, these patients are susceptible to get the fungi which generally do not produce these infections in immunocompetent host. So that's why we are here to discuss the opportunistic fungal infections in COVID-19.
You're on mute. Answer, you're on mute.
Am I audible? Sorry,
Yes.
Sorry for that. So, Dr. Vasant, moving on to you, what is your take? Because you look at a very different spectrum of patients, usually even before the COVID times, which were transplant subsets, and they all would be really compromised. So, you think there is any difference in what you used to look into your sicker population as compared to what you are now seeing with COVID-19 patients?
Yeah, so I think I fully agree with Atul about the immune system disruption which has occurred because of the virus itself, as well as the usage of widespread anti-inflammatory agents, that is the steroids, or using the IL-6 inhibitors, or using other modalities to reduce the inflammation, and there is no uniformity about the protocol across. Forget about India, in one single hospital also. So that is one thing. So that is one part, and I'll come to the clinical part. Why we are talking about opportunistic infections in the post-COVID era or in the COVID era is because we are seeing fungal infections occurring. That is invasive fungal infections like Aspergillus and Mucor, especially Mucor occurring during the hospitalization of the patient for COVID treatment. Okay, so it is. I have seen it as early as fourth day of the hospitalization, patient developing symptoms of something like mucormycosis. Okay, I've seen that on fourth day. So that means apart from this patient was of mine itself. He was just started on steroids because his CT superiority score was very high, and then he was on around 8 liters of O2. But the third day itself, he was just on 40 BD of solimidrol, methylprednisolone, and fourth day he complained of pain. So that means it is, of course, he was a diabetic patient. So there's something more than the diabetes and steroid, whether the virus itself has been immunosuppressive. So that's what one thing. And second part of the clinical part, what I want to say is that we are seeing PCP and pneumocystic carina, which normally seen in a patient with severely immunocompromised transplant population or HIV. We have seen around 5 or 6 patients with PCP in the post-COVID. That means patient who got treated better and gone home and coming back with worsening of breathlessness, and then finding that these people have got PCP. And the reason could be because of the immunosuppression and steroid, because steroid is a very good friend of PCP. The other thing is, more than PCP, what we are finding is CMV viremia. Now, this is very scary. CMV viremia is seen in a patient of HIV when the CD4 count is less than 50. So, when you have a CMV viremia, that means I'm talking about the viral loads being 1,75,000 and 1,50,000 and all that. So, when you have such worsening of the lungs and when you have such CMV viremia, that means the patient is severely immunocompromised. So, we are looking at much more than that's the reason why we are discussing about opportunistic infections in this post-COVID or COVID era.
So thank you, Dr. Vasan, for making us understand that it's a disease which catches up with those who are weakened, either because of the virus or their immunity is inherently low and they are finally falling prey, or it is the slowest moving animal in the herd who is getting caught by these devils. So coming to Dr. Atul, you have been pioneer in looking at fungus even when COVID-19 was not there. So if I ask you to draw upon the studies, the Fungal Infection Study Forum, what is the why is so much of a change seen, assuming that there is immunocompromised situation, India being diabetic capital, but is there any intrinsic change in the nature of fungal pathology or any other opportunistic infection that you want to kind of highlight upon?
You want me to speak specific about mucormycosis or any other fungus?
So maybe we can start with general and then come down to the biggest devil.
So when we talk about the increase in the incidence of the invasive fungal infections in the hospital settings, the main important reason is that now we have large number of patients who becomes immunocompromised because of the medical therapy, because now we can do a successful heart-lung transplant, we can do successful intestinal transplant. So all the solid organ transplants are now possible, and now we are creating or we are increasing the number of patients who are immunocompromised. So this is number one. The second, the important component of increase in the number of invasive fungal infection would be the patients entering into the critical care unit of any hospital. Now they survive longer because of the good and extensive invasive supportive system, which includes IABP or the ECMO or the dialysis or variety of invasive the supportive systems can prolong the life of any critically ill patients. This also contributes to the increased incidence of invasive fungal infection. The third important thing is that as we know that we are also having a challenge of multi-drug resistance bacterial infections, and we use a broad spectrum antibiotics to take care of these infections. So while using these broad spectrum antibiotics for a prolonged time, we again invite invasive fungal infection. So now we have so many reasons, the hemato-oncology setting. So because of this monoclonal or the targeted therapy in most of the hemato-oncological conditions, including the solid tumors also. So we are generating a large pool of patients whose immune system is compromised. So because of all this number of patients with a defective immune system that is keeping up, we are getting more and more the invasive fungal infections in our hospital settings.
Thank you, Dr. Atul. So that definitely, to sum it up, I think what you want to say is that probably we are fighting more aggressively with aggressive disease, keeping them alive with whatever we have from the acute fire, and then with a weakened immune system, multiple invasions done, lines, central line, arterial catheters, tubes, ventilator, tracheostomy, dialysis, ECMO. We are probably making the sick ones survive longer. Yes. They may survive the fungal infection, but may land up into a pro or an anti-inflammatory stage where they get what is called as a maybe a kind of a response of reactivation of viruses, as Dr. Vasan said, CMV or secondary bacterial infections, or these fungi which are saprophytic in nature on probably decaying and dying, systems. So, but there are certain group of people who were not supposed to be unwell at all, like young 40-year-old people who have come for COVID and were bad, but they got better. And they were looking as if doing very well. And then finally we find that he's getting a headache, and you find that now he is getting a real invasive infection. which is something which was absolutely unexpected at the start of the disease. So, Dr. Vasant, do you think our country being a diabetes capital, is it at the heart of this increased fungus, or something is wrong with the therapeutic options? And just to kind of correct, Dr. Ramasubramaniam is briefly out for a session, but he will be joining us back. So we will also include him in our session once he is back. So Dr. Vasant, over to you. What do you think is at the root? Is it really sick patients, or invasive therapy, or probably more immunomodulated therapies which are causing them? Welcome, Dr. Ram.
Yeah. So I think so. If you see, I'm working in a transplant hospital, that is a global hospital, Parade. I've been seeing the worst of the immunocompromised patient, that is the liver. I don't think there can be a worst immunosuppressed patient than a chronic liver disease patient. They are more immunosuppressed than even the HIV patients. Okay? But I'm not there, and so much of, I'm also seeing so much of renal transplant where anti-thymocyte globulins and monoclonal antibodies, basiliximab and steroids and so much being used. But I've not seen so much of this high-end infection, what we're talking about, in this subset of population. So there have been renal transplant patients who develop diabetes, that is NODAT. We call it new onset diabetes after transplant, NODAT. But even them, we are not seen, who have been on steroids and a lot of immunosuppressants, we are not seen that. So what is that? Why is this? What the patient, like what you're talking about, 40 years male who is non-diabetic and still comes up with headache and possibly developing an invasive fungal infection. So I think it is, of course, diabetes is contributory factor because of the drugs which we are using, possibly steroids at a higher dose and all that, the GRP78 receptor responsible, all that, plus the immunosuppression. And I think, I think we have to see that whether this B617.2 virus itself has been really immunosuppressive, because this is the difference between the transplant population or hematological population who have been so immunosuppressed and this population where we are using steroids and whatever tocilizumab or itolizumab and all that, is the difference in the virus in between. So whether this, apart from these factors, the virus, the Delta variant, whether itself is causing severe immunosuppression, I think we require to look at that analysis and to look at the immunological part of this subject. So that's my take on this.
Welcome, Dr. Ram. Welcome back. So just to kind of sum up all the two questions that we talk about, which I would want you to kind of sum up. Why are we talking about fungus in the middle of COVID pandemic? Number two, what is your take on the opportunistic infections overall, and which is the biggest bugbear for you there? And do you think, is it the risk factor, or purely because of India being a diabetic capital that we are seeing this kind of opportunistic infection, or there is something wrong with or maybe it's an effect or a spillover effect of the therapy for COVID-19? You are mute, sir. You are, Asawari, can you please see to it that Dr. Ram can, he's, maybe you're joined as a guest. So we'll have to ensure that his mic is working.
Yes, just looking into it. Just give me a moment.
So meanwhile, as Dr. Ram comes in, Dr. Atul, would you like to talk about fungus in general, generics? What kind of fungi are there? Just to kind of warm up the session, you would be best person to tell us septate, aseptate, and invasive, what are these fungi?
So broadly, like when we talk about the fungal infection, broadly we can divide them into two big groups. One is the yeast, and second is the mycelial fungus. So the yeast, if I talk about the yeast, so the most common yeast infection that we are getting is the Candida infection. The other most common yeast infection, especially in the immunocompromised host, would be cryptococcal infections. And there are certain fungi which are dimorphic. So they have yeast form also, as well as they also have the mycelial structure also. So these dimorphic fungi can infect immunocompetent hosts. So whatever we have talked about the opportunistic fungal infections, but this dimorphic fungi can infect. So like Histoplasma, coccidioidomycosis, This can invade even the patient who has absolutely normal immune system. Now coming to the mycelia. So we have talked about the yeast infections, which occurs into the human being. The mycelia, the most common mycelial fungal infection that we see would be the Aspergillus infection. In fact, Aspergillus can give you some allergic disorders into the human being, apart from the true invasive, life-threatening fungal infection. Another important mycelial fungus would be the mucormycosis, which the predominant host would be the diabetic patients and other immunocompromised hosts. And the other fungi, which also belongs to the mycelia, would be Dematiaceous fungi or the black fungus, the real black fungus. The mucormycosis is not a black fungus. The Dematiaceous fungus are the black fungus, and it generally invades, like it has propensity to invade the central nervous system. So apart from the skin and soft structure, it can lead to a CNS infection. So these are the broad classifications of the fungal infections into the human being. Of these, most common would be the yeast, that is Candida infection, followed by Aspergillus and mucormycosis.
Thank you, Dr. Atul. That was really very enlightening and simplifying, if I can say that, for all our audiences who are probably not initiated into microbiology or infectious disease. Basically, fungi can be broadly in 2 or 3 groups, as Dr. Atul said, and the common concerns are yeast, which we talk about. But here, somehow we are seeing a propensity for the rough ones, the tough ones, to really come over. So I will first of all come back to Dr. Ram, the initial kind of sum-ups of why fungus. What are the biggest bugbear that you feel in COVID-19 epidemic that is worrisome, and any COVID-specific risk factor that you are talking about?
Right. Sorry, apologies. There was some confusion connecting. Now, with regard to COVID, we always know that whenever somebody gets a serious viral infection, it tends to suppress the immune system and leads to occurrence of secondary bacterial infections. This has been seen with the flu. Typically, flu is what we have learned a lot from regarding COVID. So when a person gets a flu, he is predisposed to secondary bacterial infections, which in the 1918 wave was due to Streptococcus pneumoniae or pneumococcus. Subsequently, during the swine flu epidemic, we saw that the secondary bacterial infection was the MRSA, or the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. But in India, we still come across a lot of secondary gram-negative infections in patients who are severely ill with COVID, especially in the ICU. The second reason why they are predisposed to infection is that we use a lot of immunomodulatory agents, which include steroids, which include tocilizumab, which include several other agents which impair the body's immune response. And this can also lead to secondary infections, and fungal infections are typically common after that the use of these immunomodulatory agents like steroids and tocilizumab. 3, there is an issue with infection control in our hospitals. When the system gets overwhelmed with a high number of cases, the ability of us to ensure that an infected patient is separated from the others becomes a challenge. So there is a cross transmission of infections quite often, which is very difficult to prevent, even if the hospital has a good infection control program. So these are the reasons I would say we are having an increased risk of infections. With regard to any specific infection, I think what we have seen is mainly Candida in the blood, especially in people who are having central lines and who are getting broad spectrum antibiotics. And now we are seeing mucor. In future, what may be the bugbear, I still don't know. We still don't know what the correlation with mucor and COVID is. I think we have to wait for more studies or more interpretation to come up with a better answer.
Thank you, Dr. Ram, for just summing up everything. But just coming back to what we were talking about the fungi, various kind of fungus that we talk about. So I'll again ask you specifically, Dr. Ram, why do you think, is it just because of a sensationalism that mucor has kind of gone top, while bacterial infections, secondary bacterial infections probably would be responsible for more deaths in so-called recovering COVID from the hypoxic variant? Would you all agree on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Dr. Atul and Dr. Vasan, one word from you. Do you really think that mucor is the biggest secondary infectious or opportunistic infection, or there are other ones which probably get kind of hidden?
Yes, so in our experience, like the secondary bacterial infection rate in a moderate to severe or the critically ill COVID patient is much less. So, I mean, there are few patients where those who are on mechanical ventilators with multiple lines or receiving hemodialysis, they do have some bloodstream infections with, especially with the enterococcus, some Klebsiella, and few the Pseudomonas. We do have the candidemia cases in such patients who are receiving antibiotics and with the lines and etc. etc. But I mean, and we do not have a good number of COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis or the kappa patient that Europe and the United States are describing. That I mean, they are describing in a very high numbers of kappa or the COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis. We do have patients. We try to confirm a diagnosis of COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis because the diagnosis is very challenging. Like you need to do some bronchoscopy, get a lower respiratory secretions, perform a galactomannan test, perform a mycological test to demonstrate the presence of these fungi, plus galactomannan test, and if possible, you have to take a biopsy. So to reach to a final diagnosis of kappa is very difficult, but when we do a simple galactomannan analysis of the bronchoalveolar lavage, we can say that the prevalence of kappa in our COVID patient is much less compared to the European patients. This is number one. And coming to the mucormycosis, we do have a good number of patients with mucormycosis, but let me tell you that probably this year, when the number of mucormycosis cases that we are discussing is much higher, for example, the website says that from 5th May to 15th June of 2021, India has more than 31,000 mucormycosis cases. And in Gujarat also, like we have more than 2,000 mucormycosis cases. But let me tell you that when we did a study, multi-center study last year from September to December, when we try to analyze the hospitalized patient with the COVID and the number of mucormycosis diagnosed from the COVID and try to figure out the prevalence of mucormycosis in hospitalized patients with the COVID, and let me tell you that the figure is just 0.27%. So when we talk about the actual prevalence of mucormycosis in hospitalized COVID patient, it is not that high. But this year, in the second surge in India, we have large number of COVID patients. So if you are having a large number of COVID patients, and if you talk about the prevalence of 0.27, naturally, the number of mucormycosis will go up. And that's why we have absolute increase in the number of mucormycosis because of the absolute increase in the COVID cases also. So I think the prevalence would be the more or less same, just like a last year, or it may be little higher than the 0.27%. But because in second surge, we have large number of COVID patients, maybe large number of underreported COVID patients, we are seeing or we are discussing large number of mucormycosis at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. Atul. So moving on to Dr. Vasant, I have heard you use the word that we need to smell fungus. So I would ask you at this point of time, how good or bad you would be at smelling fungus in a COVID-19 patient after 7 to 14 days who has been, let's go only on the hypoxic variant or the hospitalized variant. We are not talking about people who are in the society and those who are hospitalized. So when you come as a ID specialist, when you're called up by your critical care physician or physician fraternity that something is wrong or the patient doesn't look good, or maybe you just walk in, when do you start thinking about fungus in that individual?
So I think one is Dr. VRS has already said that because of the poor infection control practices, you see a lot of Lyme-related infection. So similarly, I think whenever a patient has a new onset sepsis or fever or hemodynamic instability, that is the time I think I smell for fungus, and that fungus is Candida. Second fungus which tells me is that when it is patient is slightly improved or not improving, or there are new shadows coming, or it is becoming difficult to get him out of the ventilator, or is requiring higher oxygen, and that is the most challenge and most difficult part, and that is what is whether this patient has gotten aspergillosis or not. I think that is really a challenge. It's sometimes easier to diagnose, mucormycosis, or Candida, but difficult to diagnose aspergillosis because predominantly usually it is if it's pulmonary aspergillosis. The patient, if he's ventilated, then it's easy. But if the patient is not ventilated, if he's on HFNC or NIV, which you are handling every day, so it becomes difficult with these pulmonary shadows to find out which. So in that case, possibly what I do is I usually send a beta glucan or something, and if it is negative, then I say this this is not most likely aspergillosis. So if the beta-glucan is very, very high, if the thing of the exchange or increased oxygen requirement is there, then possibly I think whether it could be aspergillosis or can it be kappa or something like that, for which Atul was talking about. And the third thing is, I think for mucormycosis here, what we have seen in hospital, in fact, we had among the 40 patients which we had at Global Hospital, I did a epidemiological survey, or I did a subset analysis of these patients, and we found out that 30% of the patients had symptoms. Of course, they were diagnosed later on, but they had symptoms of mucormycosis when they were in hospital. Possibly the clinicians had failed to suspect mucormycosis during that time, because many of them had headaches, many of them complained of toothache, complained of loosening of the tooth or pyorrhea, or severe cheek pain. But if they were just given some anti-inflammatory or painkillers, and they were subsequently later on diagnosed mucormycosis later after discharge. But we found out that 30% of these people had started developing symptoms when they were being treated for COVID-19. So I think any patient in a hospital who is undergoing COVID treatment complains to you of sinus pain, or slight epistaxis, or loosening of the teeth, pyorrhea, or perioral numbness, or numbness on the maxillary region, or retroorbital pain, I would take it very seriously. And a couple of patients have started straight away antifungals even before the ENT person came, and ENT doctor said, no, this doesn't look, this is just a maxillary sinusitis. I did not believe that, because the clinical presentation was so classical of the patient. I straight away started an antifungal. Subsequently, patient did not believe, discharged, and then later on, after 2-3 weeks, the mucor had extended extensively, and finally it turned out to be mucor. So I think clinical, I would give a lot of weightage to patients' clinical symptoms when they are there in the hospital setting. That is for mucor. For aspergillosis, is for the suspect, and for candida also, it is for the clinician or the intensivist to smell it. Can it be candida?
Dr. Ram, here I would request you to kind of elucidate any kind of framework in which you would approach a person with a potential either hidden or manifest fungal infection. Manifest becomes too late, so the whole idea is to catch them early, probably by looking at their clinical trajectory. But are there any fungal prediction rules specifically for candida? We know that there are some, but for aspergillosis and for mucor, do you think there is some way of finding it out little early with some biochemical tests or some radiological imaging, or something else that comes to your mind?
I think the basic tenet of diagnosing anything is the cliched statement that what the mind does not know, the eye does not see. So the first thing is to understand what is the pre-test probability of a fungal infection in an individual patient. And Vasant has very clearly said that I would think of candidemia if somebody has probably a central line inside, is having diabetes with uncontrolled sugars, has received broad spectrum antibiotics, if there is any renal failure or maybe on the ventilator and other such acute interventions. Now we think of aspergillus typically in an immunosuppressed patient, but having said that, we are having increasing reports of aspergillosis in pneumonia, both in patients with chronic obstructive airway disease, patients who are chronic smokers, people who have damaged lungs, people who have problems with liver, people with liver failure, or people with, as we call it, as decompensated liver disease. All these populations, and now we are seeing, along with influenza, also aspergillosis along with influenza and COVID we have seen. In this situation, we would suspect if a person has a persistent fever and has pulmonary changes, infiltrates which are developing and not responding to antibiotics. We use biomarkers. We use what is called the galactomannan. Galactomannan typically has to be detected in the bronchoalveolar fluid after a bronchoscopy is done and that fluid is sucked out. That needs to be checked out for levels. And we also do a serum galactomannan. And we have a cutoff for this. The serum is usually 1. The bronchoalveolar lavage is also 0.5, or 1 is more sensitive in picking this up. So these biomarkers are useful. We also have another biomarker called the beta-D-glucan, which is done in the blood, which is possibly positive in several fungal infections, including candida and aspergillus, but not with mucor. For mucor, it is typically, because it's an airborne fungus, the infection is typically more common in the sinus, but it is also seen in the lung. pulmonary mucor. So if somebody presents with typical symptoms in a setting of post-COVID, steroid use, high sugars, who presents with features of pain, swelling, redness, runny eyes, we think of mucor. Of course, there is no specific biomarker, but getting a tissue and confirming it is mucor is probably the only way forward.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Thank you. So moving on to Dr. Atul, any word of wisdom from your side about identifying fungal speciation before the result has come? Looking at the clinical picture, I'm sure it is very difficult, but still, are there some cues where you would probably kind of start thinking about a type of fungus, because your empiric therapy may be probably based on that. Like Dr. Vasant said, that he was very keen about starting an antifungal even before the results has come or the ENT specialist has gone in. So what is your take on that? How is it a site-specific thought process or some kind of a clinical cue or biomarker which will make you choose the empiric antifungal?
Yeah, so I mean, this is sometimes a clinician's dilemma, especially when the patients are having symptoms of the facial pain or headache or the jaw pain, where in a COVID setting, and we were thinking in terms of invasive sinusitis with the fungi. And once the ENT guys set in and do a sinoscopic examination, the microbiology lab can give us good information about the fungi within 30 minutes of sample reaching to a microbiology lab by doing a direct microscopic examination and or the calcofluor white stain examination. But many times the microbiologists are not sure, but most of the time when we talk about the differentiation of aspergillus from mucormycosis on direct microscopy, the morphological characteristics are important to identify that, look, this is predominant aspergillus infection by looking at the thin multiseptate and the acute angle branching on the direct microscopic examination, compared to a broad pauciseptate or the aseptate 90-degree branching, folded, ribbon-like. So this is a typical description of a Mucorales species. But few patients, like during this COVID patient who has mucormycosis, we have many patients who has mixed infection. So sometimes what happens when the sinoscopy is performed or the bronchoscopy is performed, one fungus was predominant. Say, for example, like even though like patient is having COVID, uncontrolled diabetes, and the risk factors for mucormycosis with typical clinical presentations, and the microbiologist is looking at pure aspergillus, in such situation, I'll still prefer to start antifungal drug which is taking care of both aspergillus as well as the mucors. Right. So most of these, like when we talk about the antifungal agents like amphotericin take care of both the fungi. Even the isavuconazole can take care of both the fungi and posaconazole, right? So we have to start any of this which is available. This is very important because antifungal drugs were not available to us during the month of late April, May, where I mean we were handicapped for the treatment of this patient with fungal infection. But differentiation is very important, and especially like for mucor also. So if when you talk about the species identification, this is, I think, very important, especially in a tertiary care setting, not for all the centers, but if you are working in a tertiary care centers, try to speciate the Mucorales which is responsible for mucormycosis in your patients, because we know that the Rhizopus species are the most common fungal species which is a cause for mucormycosis in our Indian patients. But in our previous study, which was published in 2020, we found that Rhizopus microsporus and Rhizopus homothelicus, these two species are rising alarmingly in Indian patients diagnosed with the mucormycosis. The other important species that we could identify in our Indian patients were Apophysomyces. Why this fungal species is important? Because Apophysomyces has higher MIC for amphotericin B. So if you are relying solely on amphotericin B for the treatment of mucormycosis caused by Apophysomyces, then there are chances that you may fail and patients can have progressive disease. And that's the reason that species identification in such case would be very important. Cunningham-Mela, recently we had a patient, currently patient is under our care, who is having COVID-associated mucormycosis, and we have isolated Cunningham-Mela. So the isolate was sent to PGI for confirmations, and the drug susceptibility, it was confirmed with Cunningham-Mela. And drug susceptibility showed that amphotericin MIC was 1, right? And the posaconazole MIC was less than 0.25. So obviously, like we have to change antifungal therapy, because we know that Cunningham is also having a very high MIC and sometimes it is very difficult to achieve. So if you are working in tertiary care centers and if your microbiology is having a good facility, try to get morphological identification, use PCR to speciate as well as to confirm your mucormycosis diagnosis, and also take a help from the referral centers. We have two good referral centers in India. One is at PGI Chandigarh and second is at Vallabhbhai Patel Chest Institute in Delhi. So both these fungal referral centers will give you a final species identification as well as the drug susceptibility testing. So I think this is of value in certain subgroup of the patient, but large number of patients can be taken care by the standard recommended therapy.
So thank you, Dr. Atul, for such a detailed response. I think what we need to underline probably at this point of time at this forum is that when you have a strong suspicion or identification of a fungal infection, it's important to involve a senior infectious disease consultant or physicians who are used to treating them, because there could be a lot of traps around. You may probably be not appropriately treating, and your team should be multidisciplinary. Dr. Vasan, how would you kind of approach a diagnosed fungal infection? Let's say it's a mucor, and then we will come to Aspergillus. But mucor, if you are identifying, let's say, mucor in a sinus of a recovering COVID-19 patient who is diabetic and who has all the typical features, and you have to start some empiric therapy, but how would you actually approach with your team to take care of this guy? What are the red flags? What are the things you will be monitoring for?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can. If you can take the mask out, it will be better probably for our audience. Yeah.
2 minutes.
First time I'm hearing somebody tell an ID specialist take your mask off.
Yeah, that's the defense of the ID. The best defense.
Right. So I think your question was, Ansari, was ki if I have a
For
patient.
mucor, how would you approach? So you have a mucor in your ICU. Now you have a team. So how do you build a multidisciplinary team to treat that, or it's not necessary? Yeah.
No, so I think it's very, very important, and your clinical outcome of the patient also will be definitely better off if you have a multidisciplinary team. For example, I just tell you our global hospital, where we have a multidisciplinary mucormycosis clinic or mucormycosis team, which is headed by the ENT surgeon. I am a part of the team. Then we have a metabolic physician, metabolic endocrinologist who looks after the diabetic part. We have a oral dental surgeon or maxillofacial dental surgeon who, to begin with, before the surgery, takes the dental measurements of the patient even before the surgery is done. So every patient goes for the dental measurements, because you don't know whose maxilla will be or whose palate will go up, and then you know taking the measurements will be regular. We have an ophthalmologist and a radiologist and a regular physician who looks after the sodium potassium level. So we have a multidisciplinary team, and at many of the times I round with my ENT surgeon and the physician or the metabolic physician together. Sometimes we round for 4 hours when we had 25 patients at a time admitted of mucor post-COVID. So and our clinical outcomes have been favorable, that is what because of the multidisciplinary team. And I'm telling you, the clinical outcomes I'm hearing from other centers have been, mortalities have been higher, possibly not having a multidisciplinary team. So I think Atul and VRS sir also will agree that unless you have this sort of a multidisciplinary team and interacting with each other, it should not be that, I come and see the patient, the ENT surgeon comes and sees the patient, the endocrinologist sees the patient goes. It is together discussing these patients possibly at least twice or thrice a week when you're rounding together. It makes a huge difference to the patient as well as the confidence of the patient. And you can whatever I miss out is pointed out by someone else, and we have a discussion on each other. We do see the MRI, CT scans together. We discuss the cultures together and what more requires to be done for the better clinical outcome of this patient. So I think from all this, this multidisciplinary team would definitely be of great help, and I think that is a way to go forward.
So coming to you, Dr. Ram, for the difficult question. The difficult part is the treatment DIY, do it yourself, or is there some kind of algorithmic approach for our country, especially with OPPI listening, that we have real paucity of good quality antifungal drugs at the time when they are needed. So now is a difficult part. What do you feel? How should a clinician approach, or do we all need to come together to have some national urgent guidelines in these kind of difficult times?
Right. I think there's always an ideal way to approach, and a lot of the Western guidelines give the ideal approach where you have to, what is recommended is the liposomal amphotericin B. Liposomal amphotericin B, a vial of 50 milligram costs in the range of about 7,000 to 8,000 rupees. And you need to give a patient a dose of generally 3 to 5 milligrams. And if you are treating severe infections, at least 5 milligrams per kilogram, which works out to a dose of about anywhere from 250 to 500 milligrams per day. So if you do the mathematics, one person per day will spend anywhere in the region of 50,000 or 40,000 to close to a lakh per day. And to complicate matters, we still are not sure how long this has to be given. Earlier, there used to be a cumulative dose. Now it says that it depends on the response and to the extent of your surgical debridement. So we are still not very clear as to the exact endpoint or the duration of therapy still. So if you look at the Western guidelines, I don't think anybody in India can be treated for mucor. And to top it, you have a severe shortage of liposomal amphotericin B. So what we have to do in India is be more practical, customized for a patient. The conventional amphotericin B, which costs about less than 500 rupees per vial of 50 milligrams, and the dose is only 0.7 to 1 milligram per kilogram. So you need 1 to 1.5 vials a day at the most, is what is, it's actually discouraged in Western guidelines because of there is a higher risk of nephrotoxicity, problems with the kidney. But in India, we tend to use it because it is more available, more practical, less expensive, and we are comfortable using it because we have learned to monitor and keep your potassium and creatinine levels regularly monitored to ensure that we do not do much harm. So we have guidelines. The fungal, Atul has team has come up with wonderful guidelines on the fungal study, infection study forum, where the guidelines are customized to the Indian scenario, where what is recommended is if liposomal amphotericin B is not available or cannot be afforded, we use conventional amphotericin. How long do you give? We suggest at least 1 week, if possible 2 weeks. So preferably 7 to 10 days of IV conventional amphotericin, which is not expensive, given as an extended infusion instead of giving it for 2 hours or 4 hours. If you're able to prolong it to more than 10, 12 hours and preload with some saline, flush the kidneys or give high hydration, the nephrotoxicity can be minimized. So use it for 7 to 10 days at least, and then overlap it and follow it with posaconazole, or another option is isavuconazole. In fact, the fungal study forum has also given itraconazole as an option, because even though it is not recommended, in a situation where nothing is available, itraconazole can be tried. So give injectable amphotericin, follow it up with oral posaconazole tablets or isavuconazole tablets, and depending on the extent of involvement, the surgical debridement and the response, you can tone it down to anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks if necessary and monitor the patient.
Thank you, Dr. Moving on, Dr. Atul, you being the co-chair of FISF, now it's for you to kind of take it further and finally sum it up. What should be the approach so that we can have take-home messages? If once you have fungal speciation done, how would you approach? What's the best possible approach for our subcontinent?
Yeah. So when we talk about mucormycosis, it is considered as a medical emergency. So this is one of the medical emergency where you need to administer appropriate antifungal agents as soon as possible. So Vasant has also rightly said that once you have clinically suspected, get the tissue sample done as soon as possible, get information from microbiology lab and start the first dose of amphotericin B as soon as possible. So in treatment, when there is an ideal situation, everything is available and patient can afford, the drug of choice would be the liposomal amphotericin B for the obvious reason. The favorable point for liposomal amphotericin B would be it is less nephrotoxic, and the second thing is that it is a little targeted therapy. When we talk about the liposomes, these liposomes are phagocytosized by the macrophages, and these macrophages will reach to the site of infection. So it will deliver this drug at the site of infection. So it will be a targeted therapy. So less toxic, targeted therapy, and it is associated with the better outcome. So in our study in 2020 that we have published in Clinical Microbiology and Infection, it was clearly shown that the liposomal amphotericin B was associated with a far more superior response compared to using a conventional amphotericin B. So in ideal situation, if all the drugs are available, then probably the drug of choice would be liposomal amphotericin B. For a patient who has mucormycosis and the disease is restricted to the paranasal sinuses and it is not extended to the orbital apex or it is not extended into the intracranial cavities like cavernous sinus or the frontal or the temporal lobe, then for a limited disease, the short-term amphotericin B therapy is probably very useful. Like we generally go for 3 to 4 weeks of amphotericin B therapy for a patient who has limited disease. But for those patients who has intracranial extension, extensive orbital involvement, then the patient who has the disease which has entered into the brain requires very high dose of amphotericin B, and that is 10 milligram per kilogram per day. So the cost would be very high, but because this dose is required to take care of the fungi which is there into the brain. So this high dose prolonged therapy is required for 4 to 6 week time. Again, you can prolong this 4 to 6 week time depending on the clinical and radiological response. And after that, what Ram says that we have to step down to the oral therapy, that is either with the posaconazole or with the isavuconazole. And the duration of therapy of both these azole as a consolidation would be indefinite. So we do not know the exact endpoint of therapy when we are going to stop antifungal therapy for a patient who has received a diagnosis of mucormycosis. But in general, most of these patients, they do require total antifungal duration therapy for 3 to 6 months time. And the treatment discontinuation points would be 3. One is clinical recovery, so patient is having a stable disease or patient is improvement in clinical terms. The second is radiological recovery. Many times the radiological recovery assessment would be very difficult because patient has underwent repeated sinoscopic debridement, repeated endoscopic surgery. So to interpret the local area in the paranasal sinus, it would be much difficult. But radiological, the assessment is very important to demonstrate that there is no disease progressions from the previous scan in a stable patient. So this is why we also rely more on the radiological recovery. So this is another important. And the third important parameters would be mycological recovery or the mycological response. So when patient is going for a subsequent sinoscopic debridement, say for example, after 2 weeks of antifungal therapy, we repeat the sinoscopic examination just to remove whatever the necrotic portions is remaining, because these fungus have a characteristics to produce angioinvasion. So even with the first sinoscopic surgery and antifungal therapy, the disease is going to progress. And with the effective antifungal therapy, now patients can have good line of demarcations between healthy and the dead tissue. So with the subsequent sinoscopic examination, the ENT surgeon will be able to see the line of demarcation from the healthy tissue to the infected or the necrosed area. So he can easily pull out the damage or the dead or the necrosed area. So when you do a debulking, you are also removing a large chunk of the fungi which is there, and this drug is not going to penetrate in this dead necrotic area. So this sinoscopic debridement or surgery is extremely important component of treatment of mucormycosis. So we cannot rely solely on amphotericin B. We need to debulk the lesion. We need to debride. We need to remove all the dead portion, because the dead portion removal will also remove the fungi which is live there. So this is very important. So this is how we decide the treatment endpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Atul. So now we will be taking certain panel questions, and I will start with Dr. Vasant, but anybody can kind of pitch in if that question can be answered by anyone. So one of the question is, does intake of...
With your permission, can I ask a question to Atul?
Please. Yeah, we'll take the question. First, we'll have the panelists asking question to each other, and then probably we'll take the question from the audience. Yeah.
So for my benefit, I'm asking. So Atul, I wanted to ask you, radiological, as you correctly said, no, because so much of cutting goes on and all that. So radiologically, it becomes very difficult. So we go more clinically, and only if indicated, we do a radiological, early radiology, MR repeating, and we try to avoid as much as possible. We go more clinically as far and repeating the sinoscopy. First, the question is whether doing a PET scan at 3 months just before you that is at that is 12 weeks, just whether you want to stop it. There, whether PET scan, I'm not done it, I'm just asking whether PET scan will help you to know whether you want, the patient is clinically doing extremely well, and so sometimes even if you repeat an MRI, it will just show some thickening here and there. So whether doing a regional PET at 3 months will tell you whether you have to do it just like we used to do for gadolinium scan for skull-based osteomyelitis. So the time the gadolinium uptake is not there in the skull-based osteomyelitis, we used to stop the treatment. It could have been 6 weeks or sometimes even 4 months. So that is the first question. And second is, when you do a sinoscopy, of course, we do send tissue for culture and histopathology. Suppose if it just shows fungal hyphae, but the cultures are negative, would you give importance to that? Of course, the culture comes positive from the sinoscopy, you will definitely give importance. But suppose if it just shows fungal hyphae, which could be a dead hyphae or whatever, would you give importance to that, and the culture is negative? So I just wanted to know for my benefit, I'm asking.
Yeah. So second question is very easy for me, so that's why I will give you answer of second question first. So when you are have the fungal hyphae present into the tissue and histopathology and culture is negative, this is a normal finding. So we cannot take it as if the hyphal structures are dead and it is unculturable or they are not live, because in half of the patients, even though patient is having mucormycosis, the culture will become negative. Culture will become negative. The reason is that this is a posiseptate or the aseptate fungi. So when the tissue reaches to a microbiology lab, and if the microbiologist is handling this tissue roughly, like it is centrifuging or it is the tissue is being grinded before it is subjected for culture, then the grinding or the aggressive handling of the tissue into the microbiological lab will damage whatever the septa is there into the mucorale hyphae, and the culture becomes sterile. So half of the mucormycosis patient, the culture is sterile. This is a norm. This is a standard findings. So getting a negative culture, I think it is not a good marker that this patient is having a dead fungus and now we can stop therapy. No, this patient still can have viable fungus and these patients can have still ongoing mucormycosis. Now coming to the first question. The PET-CT has not been studied in mucormycosis patients, but let me tell you that what is the importance of the follow-up radiological evaluation of this patient. Because whenever the patient has started mucormycosis and once patient comes to a clinician, we make a diagnosis. During this time, there is a significant angio invasions by the mucormycosis, and this angio invasion leads to the dissemination of the fungus, especially into the paranasal sinus bones, the skull, as well as the surrounding bones, including the upper and the lower jaw. And patients can have patchy involvement of the surrounding bony structure as well as the soft tissue. So what will happen once you have treated your patients for 4 weeks or the 6 weeks with the amphotericin B, and now patient is on posaconazole or isavuconazole. After a few months of your successful treatment, so-called successful treatment, where patient has clinical response, patient is stable, patient is having normal appetite and everything is normal, because of the initial angio invasions and the compromising the blood supplies to the paranasal sinus bones or the upper jaw, lower jaw, there will be a bone infarctions, and now these bones will start having osteonecrosis over a period of 2 to 3 months after the patient has received a diagnosis of mucormycosis, and it will produces the osteonecrosis will produces some discharge from that particular area. Patients can have spontaneous the discharge from the nasal sinuses if the sinus bones are involved, or if the upper jaw is involved, then patients can have loosening of the teeth. The upper jaw may be eroded and patient will have sinuses from this place, where we need to debride. We need to remove all the dead necrotic bone chips or whatever the necrotic material is coming out. And this is a normal response to your complete treatment. This is just the bone which has necrosed, bone which has got infarcted during the initial phase of the invasions by mucormycosis. Now over a period of 2 to 3 months, there is a necrosis of the bone, and the bone gets the osteonecrosis, and the necrosed debris will be coming out from some area. So we need to find out those areas. So if you look into the CDC paper, I have put one 3D photograph of one of our patients, where you will see that there is a patchy involvement of paranasal sinus, the orbital, the medial surface, inferior surface, upper jaw, as well as the lower jaw, and all these bones get infarcted. and there is a spontaneous discharge from the lower lid, below the lower lid, because the lower floor of the orbital bone was involved. Patient has loosening of the upper and the lower teeth, and this is very common. So we need to identify those areas. So we need to reassure our patient. Otherwise, patient will say that still I am having a disease. I am getting a new swelling, new discharge from the lower eyelid or from the supraorbital region. So we need to debride. Just don't give antifungal therapy. Once you have completed 3 to 6 months of therapy, this all dead necrotic portion requires little bit of dressing, little bit of cleaning that area. Just put an incision, just remove all the dead necrotic area, and the patient will be fine.
Thank you, Doctor. I think I'll now move on to Dr. Ram. Taking a few questions from the audience. They have a lot of interesting questions. Some of them are not very interesting as well, like what is green fungus? So before that, I'll ask Dr. Ram about CDC has shared some behavioral guidance with fully vaccinated people on how can they engage with each other. Do we have anything similar in India? So there's a little different, but I want to hear from you. Is there any behavioral guide for Indian population now?
No, I'm not aware of any specific official guidelines from the Ministry of Health. The CDC has come up with specific guidelines on once you have had 2 doses of vaccine and have completed 2 weeks, which is what is the time taken after the vaccine to say that you're vaccinated. Because a lot of people take 1 vaccine, a lot of people take 2 vaccines and think they are protected. It is actually 2 weeks after the second vaccine when you are believed to be vaccinated. And the relaxation and several things, including you can be unmasked. You don't need to have testing, especially if you're traveling in the US. If you are exposed to a person who is COVID positive, you don't need to quarantine or routinely test yourself if you're asymptomatic. All these are clearly given, but our ministry, as far as I am aware, does not have recommendations yet in these aspects. Hopefully it should come soon, because the percentage of second dose is only now coming closer to double digits, I hope. So it's, I think, still in the region of 7 to 8%. So we have to wait.
And then second question, just into how can we prevent all these fungal infections, as the treatment we are discussing can't be affordable by more than 90%. So we were trying to find out what is the easier way. But is there any kind of a combination therapy of 2 weak antifungal which can probably replace the usage of a liposomal thing? Or is there something which can be a way to look forward? Is there something like that?
For me?
Yeah, you can answer it, and then I'll come to Dr. Atul. Yeah.
Right. No, as of now, there is no role for any combination therapy for mucor at all. Definitely not in the situation of COVID, where generally the immune system is reasonably robust. No, it sounds exciting that instead of using an expensive, you use 2 weak ones. They maybe combine itraconazole with something else. No, I don't think there is any role. Whatever you use the correct dose and the correct duration. I think that is what we need to learn. The other question, I forget, the one before this.
No, this is why. Is there any behavioral action which can prevent fungal infections?
Right. We still don't know exactly what the reason is for people with COVID to get the infection. We know definitely COVID is a factor. We know that there is a use of steroids is a factor. We know that probably the hyperglycemia or the high sugars associated with steroid use is a factor, but we are still not clear what the others are. These 3 can be reasonably controlled, which means do not take steroids unless the person is having a low oxygen, which warrants or where steroids are indicated. If you are having steroids, or even otherwise, ensure that your sugar levels are controlled. This is very clear. Beyond this, it is all,
So I think just to kind of give an answer, a consolidated answer from this platform, is that steroid stewardship program is very, very important in all the institutions which are treating COVID, because I think that's the easiest modifiable factor. And I think multiple trials have repeatedly shown that unless a person has developed hypoxemia, there is no benefit of using a steroid, and that too preferably in the first 7 days. So probably moderate or severe illness, consider steroid if your conventional therapy and supportive therapy is not helping, and probably that will go a long way in not reducing the immunity. But coming quickly to Dr. Vasant, is there an immunometer? Because that's something which I wish we all had. There is a score. Is there a composite score, or would you like to work on that direction where absolute lymphocyte count, your neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, maybe your CD4, CD8, or your IL-6 or other immunomodulators? If you can have a modeling where you can tell that this gentleman during the course of illness has started to become immunocompromised to catch these opportunistic infections?
So I think it's a very nice question, and that always keeps bothering me. Which patients will be highly immunosuppressed, or which patients would be more prone for any of these infections we are talking about. And I think not every patient, but we thought of doing a CD4 subset analysis. Dr. Abhay is a hematologist. So along with that, we did plan to do a CD4 subset analysis for all patients who are having severe COVID or who have developed opportunistic infection because of the COVID. I wish there would be some guidelines for that. I don't think we have any of these, but I don't know whether Atul, you have any idea on this, or VRS in the same. So we were looking at CD4 subset analysis and doing the IgG IgM levels. So I think in a couple of patients, IgG IgM all that became negative, but CD4 subset analysis is what we are looking at to look into these patients with severe COVID or people having opportunistic infections.
Dr. Atul, anything to take it further? The same point?
I have a little disagreement. The role of CD4 in COVID. So when we talk about the COVID infection, the CD4 and CD8, both the cells will go down with the acute COVID infection. This is a normal and natural response to the COVID infection. And these patients, once the viremic phase of the COVID has gone down, the active viral replication, and when the patient has entered into the second week of hyperinflammatory phase, gradually both these cells will start recovering. So all the COVID patients will have very low CD4 count and very low CD8 count, but their ratio is preserved. So their ratio is normal, even though patient is having moderate to severe or the critical COVID illness during the first week of time. So this CD4 probably may not be helpful in assessment of the immune system in the COVID patients. This is number one. But coming to your very important questions, like can we prevent these fungal infections in COVID patients or the prophylaxis? I think this is very important. That and what Ramesh says, I fully endorse that statement. But I have little issue with the statement that we are using for steroids. The main issue of mucormycosis in COVID patient is that it is not a steroid, it is a diabetes which is responsible for the mucormycosis in COVID patients. Our paper clearly shown that, because in our study that we published into the CDC, we have studied the CAM, that is COVID associated mucormycosis, at the same time the mucormycosis without COVID from September to December. And we have also requested the participating centers to send their mucormycosis patients in the previous year in September to December. So in 2019, how many mucormycosis they have diagnosed and treated at their center, and we have compared with the 2020 patients. And what we found that the COVID unassociated mucormycosis number remains the same, but the COVID associated mucormycosis has increased in the number, and we have total 287 patients, out of which 92 patients were COVID unassociated mucormycosis. And in previous year, all the centers have contributed almost 108 or 102 patients. So the numbers were same, COVID unassociated. And the whatever increase in the number of mucormycosis were related to the COVID. And in COVID, this is very important. In COVID, the mucormycosis patients has the higher chances of newly detected diabetes compared to COVID unassociated mucormycosis, and it is exactly double. So newly detected diabetes in COVID associated mucormycosis was double in our study. This is number one. Number two, the patient with diabetic ketoacidosis is also double in COVID associated mucormycosis compared to mucormycosis during the same study period from that center. So we know that like 65% of our patients has a diabetes as a risk factor, but in COVID associated mucormycosis, the diabetes, the chances of diabetic patient is much higher, plus complications of diabetes, that is DKA, is double compared to COVID unassociated mucormycosis. That means that diabetes is the sole factor which is probably responsible for the mucormycosis. Now coming to the issue of steroids, we all talk about that inappropriate use of steroids. Like we have many patients who has received steroids for 5 days and patient ends up with mucormycosis. You will not find any medical conditions where the patient has received steroid for 5 days and patient will end up with a mucormycosis. In my hospital in last year, we have treated one gentleman who is hypoxia, who is 82 years old, and he is not diabetic, he is hypertensive and ischemic heart disease, and he has moderate the COVID illness and requires oxygen therapy and 3 days of ICU admission and then shipped back to the ward. So he received 0.1 milligram per kg of dexamethasone, and total duration of dexamethasone for him was 10 days, because I have prescribed dexamethasone to this gentleman. And this gentleman came after 1 week to our clinic with pulmonary mucormycosis. He was never diabetic, right? So COVID per se is probably responsible for the mucormycosis. This is number one. And number two, the uncontrolled diabetes and the complications of diabetes are very important factors for development of mucormycosis in COVID patients. And steroid probably playing a role by aggravating or giving uncontrolled diabetes or the complications of diabetes. And if you are using very high dose for a prolonged period, then steroid has its own property to produce innate immune system suppressions, especially the macrophage and the neutrophil qualitative dysfunctions, which can lead to which allows the invasions of mucormycosis to the paranasal sinus or into the pulmonary tissue. So I think number one cause would be diabetes, number two would be COVID per se. We need to confirm this, and steroid is probably number three. And tocilizumab, like in our study, we do not see any patient who has increased risk of mucormycosis because of tocilizumab therapy.
Thank you, Dr. Atul, for that comprehensive answer. There is one question which has come, maybe Dr. Ram can take over. Is tinnitus seen in COVID recovered patients or asymptomatic COVID patients? I don't know what they meant, maybe for patients with mucor or some kind of an invasive fungal infection, or in general. Maybe you can just kind of answer. This was from one of our audience.
Yeah, I think there are several symptoms which have been described, including a sudden loss of hearing in both ears. There are several, symptoms, including tinnitus, which have been, expressed in COVID. We are still not sure whether these are actual associations or just, they are causal, or whether they are just seen concomitantly. But several system involvements have been noted with COVID, some of them where we cannot explain the rationale why it should happen. But yes, we have seen case reports of several cases.
And just on just a kind of inquisitive question, there was one low resource hack. So is it possible to make a conventional amphotericin B at the bedside look or work like some kind of a liposomal or an emulsion by using some kind of maybe a lipid carrier agent?
Yeah, Atul, you can take that.
Okay, one by one.
Jugaad.
Jugaad, yeah, Indian Jugaad.
Yes. So I think the conventional amphotericin B is clearly an inferior therapy even in our Indian studies. So we cannot say that only global guideline is recommending liposomal amphotericin B. Our own study also supports the use of liposomal because of obvious reason. But yes, I agree that when the liposomal is not available, the 1 milligram per kilogram dose of conventional, that is amphotericin B deoxycholate, is worth trying. And Ram has clearly said that if you preload this patient with saline, so infuse them with 500 cc of normal saline, increase the circulating volume. So that's why it will reduces the nephrotoxicity by the conventional amphotericin B. And the second important point, Ram has also told us that give prolonged infusions. So what I do that when I use conventional amphotericin B, I dissolve the injection material into the 10 cc of water for injection, then further dilute this 10 cc of water for injections to the 40 cc of 5% dextrose, prepare a 50 ml, and we give through the infusion pump 7 ml per hour. So entire infusion will run for 7 hours for my patients, and we pre-hydrate them with normal saline 500 ml before we start them on amphotericin B. So this is how we manage our patients, and this has really worked in reducing especially the nephrotoxicity of my patients, and they have tolerated this drug nicely. So rather than doing an Indian Jugaad in putting into the intralipid or the lipid solution, I think giving a prolonged infusions and pre-hydrate them with saline will work good. So I think rather than doing all this stuff, we can infuse like this.
Dr. Vasant, one last question before we come to the end of the session, and we'll hand over it to Asawari. Is there really some kind of a nomenclature like black, green, white fungus, or is it all just kind of of no meaning at all? Because public is really very, very influenced or maybe captivated by these terminologies. What do you feel, Dr. Vasan? Is there any kind of reason?
So I think it is always black, red, yellow. I'm also reading for the first time in my lifetime. But I know about black fungus, and what Atul described is about the Cladophila bantani, which is the real black fungus, which is seen in immunocompetent people, which is not seen in immunocompromised. It is seen in younger immunocompetent people. That is what I know. Rest of the colors is I am not aware about whether these are associated with any fungi. Yes, white, I know Candida, but Baki, green, red, blue, I'm not aware about.
Thank you, all of you, for such a wonderful and engaging discussion. And I think I will hand over. We are probably in the interest of time. I need to hand it over to Asavari to really take it over. And if there is any question which we were not able to, kind of address, we can probably do it now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ansari. Thank you so much to the entire panel for such an insightful and engaging discussion. In fact, Dr. Ansari, I'm sure we've been able to answer all the questions from our participants. And I hand it over now to the Director General OPPI, Mr. KG Ananthakrishnan, for a vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Asavari. I would like to take this opportunity to tell our panel, in my opinion, that people who have not attended probably have missed something. It was an extraordinary panel, a brilliant discussion, some practical solutions that were being provided during the discussions. And Dr. Ansari, the way that you was and thank you so much for accepting to chair and coordinate and moderate this particular session. I would also like to thank Dr. Atul Patel, really sharing some of the scientific, practical, documented and data-based information, which I think is so important in managing the situation. And I particularly liked Dr. Atul Patel that you did not go the Jugaad route. You stuck to the science and said that this is for your for your insights. Dr. Vasan Nagvekar, again, a wonderful explanation of the situations that you are handling, and we really appreciate your taking the time and joining this particular panel. And Dr. Balasubramaniam, I think again, Ram Subramaniam, again, it is so nice to see a very practical and fact-based approach, because one of the issues that we are trying to address, sir, is that there is so much of misinformation that is going on, across, and we are trying to see with this association of members that we have, in fact, I'm so thankful that we have with us today International Alliance of Patient Organization, Nat Health, Indian Pharmaceutical Association, and Seer Pharma, because our idea is strengthen the hands of the government and give the right information, burst the myths, so that both the doctors, physicians, as well as the patients get the right information. And I think towards that, we are very, very thankful to you for the session that we have had today. I will thank colleagues, Asavari, for really managing the whole stuff from the background, Clara and Sohail, who helped us in this technology support. And thanks also for taking so many questions, and I like the way Dr. Nagvekar said about the colors, this has become a sort of a, everybody is talking about colors rather than science. So thanks for that clarification as well. And what we will be doing is that this particular session will be medical, so that they can view it. It will be then so that people can educate themselves and manage patients in a far better manner with these practical tips that you have provided. We are deeply indebted, and thank you so much for joining us today in this first of the knowledge series that we have started. Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.